Hello. Good evening. I say evening because it's evening for me for sure. My name is Michael Diamond. Welcome to the Old Ways Twitch. And we've got some Miskatonic repository authors to talk to, but we have to get the propers out of the way first. So, as we would normally do on any sort of episode, we want to welcome you in. We hope you are having a wonderful night. If someone out there in our wonderful chat group just let me know that they're hearing me, I'd appreciate that just as a sound check. It's always helpful. I have two wonderful people with me this evening, and we hope that you'll get an opportunity to learn a lot from them. I suggest you take notes. If you don't, then just remember that this will be in video demand soon, and it'll be over on our YouTube channel at the Old Ways Podcast. So if you're not also checking out all the stuff we have to offer on YouTube, please do that as well. If you're not a Patreon member, the show gets support from its Patreon members, like some of them which are in chat right now, and we appreciate them immensely. And so we'll just sort of plug our own Patreon because, well, it's our channel and we can do those things. So if you haven't had a chance to check out what we offer, please do. Great way to support a show that is all about showing many different worlds, many different ways. And with that in mind, I will begin our introduction. So I will let our introduction begin to my right.
Hey y'all, I'm Rina. My pronouns are they, them, and you may know me from the Horror on the Orient Express campaign, where I started off with the Old Ways, and currently on the Coriolis campaign with Children of the Periphery, which is a great deal of fun. I hope you'll check that out if you haven't already. I'm also the head of Mythos on the Old Ways, so you can find me doing all sorts of delicious and delightful, horrible things to people through the Cthulhu mythos, various and sundry things, including an upcoming project that I don't know if it's been announced yet, but that will be coming out later this month, I believe, Mike.
Well, it hasn't been announced, but we can riff here during intros. It's fine. I will happily advise everyone that the first episode of Something from the Repository is going to air next week that Rina ran. So maybe if you want to give a little bit of sort of a shout out to the person as the first time.
Yep. So I ran Lights in the Trees by Matt Doc Tracy, which is a fantastic, horrible little scenario set in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. I had a really great cast for the scenario. It's really, really fun. Please check it out on the Miskatonic repository and check out our playthrough of it when it comes out. I had a really great time running that scenario. So you can listen to that when the first part drops next week. You can also find all of my scenarios, of which there are several, over on Drive-Thru RPG, including the gold bestseller Saturday the 14th, and my most recent scenario, A Long Day's Night, which is a mobster's 1950s scenario. And I have an upcoming scenario, an LGBTQ plus Cthulhu scenario called Friends of Dorothy. That'll be coming out here in the next few weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And I love to chat about people's scenarios, about editing. I do a lot of editing for people on the Miskatonic repository. So if you're looking for someone to edit your scenario, to do a read through, do some content review, whatever, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find me on the Old Ways Discord as Rina. I am inevitable. I am everywhere. But yep, that's me. And please don't hesitate to reach out. I love to talk to people about my scenarios and everything Cthulhu and horror related, and also post pictures of my cat. So
yes, as in Garrick we trust. I actually had the opportunity to play in a playtest of that upcoming scenario. I had a lot of fun, and I like the theme, the settings, and all of the options. I like scenarios with options, which we'll get a chance to talk about. Now, our other guest, if they would introduce themselves, we'd appreciate that as well.
Yes, I go by Keeper Doc or Dactyl Doc. Name's Dave, but you can find me on Facebook as Dactyl Doc and lurking on Discords as Keeper Doc. I write and run games, primarily those involving the Cthulhu mythos. I'm a longtime fan of the Old Ways podcast and really enjoying my first outing here. In addition to running Cthulhu-based games, I am a huge fan of DCC, Free League products, including Alien, Pirate Borg, Dragonbane, I blog regularly, semi-regularly, at the prosperopublishing.com website. It's mostly about Call of Cthulhu, mostly about Masks of Nyarlathotep, but I have recently branched out into discussing impossible landscapes as well as some aspects of TTRPG creation. I am a one-time published TT Swamp Song Drive-Through RPG Miskatonic Repository gold best-selling scenario. I am just like intimidated by Rina's prolific output. It is incredible. And I'm about to release my second scenario. This is going to be a collaboration with Alex of Viral fame and all of the Grindhouse scenarios. This is going to be in the Grindhouse flavor. Really excited about that. Should be arriving in the next month. I've got a couple other collaborations in the works, including something with Matt Doc Tracy. So we're doing a 2-doc product with something academically oriented, and we're getting that underway.
A little breaking news, double doc action here.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. I suppose, I too actually have a scenario in the Miskatonic repository as well, Time of the Serpent. So it sort of kicked off part of our Masks campaign on the old ways without the players knowing that they were, in effect, helping me write a debut scenario. So that's fun. So I've got a little bit of publishing chops there as well, although I've not wielded my pen very recently in those regards, but that's okay because I have two amazing guests who have. So I think that scenario creation can go in a lot of directions. I think there's a lot of ways we could sort of unpack this Christmas present for our viewers. But one of the things that I like to make sure we talk about is, how does writing for the Miskatonic repository, how does it mirror traditional writing, whether that be short form, whether it be long form writing? And then how is it wholly and totally different? And the question is a toss up. So I'm happy to have either one of you start. We don't have to go in any specific order, and feel free to totally mash up and change the question too, or put it in a different direction in your own light too. Full editorial control here.
So, as a short story writer, that's something else I do in my spare time. The similarities are obviously you have your act structure. Generally, when it comes to writing your scenarios, you might have more than than a 3-act structure. You might have things that go in different places. You might have pieces that move, like you can go to one place first and in one playthrough, and then another piece in a different playthrough. But you're still going to have that act structure, right? You're still going to have the scenes that people go through. You're still going to have an opening. You're going to have a closing. The structure, in a lot of ways, is very similar, and I approach it that way as well. Sometimes thinking about the storylines first versus the structure first, and it's going to have a lot of similarities when you're writing the actual story to writing short stories. I've never written a novel, so I can't speak to that as much when it comes to the writing side of things. But short story wise, there's a lot of compatibility and a lot of overlap there. I tend to visualize my scenarios as a story, as a short form story, novella kind of thing when I'm approaching it. On the differences side, things are a lot more movable than they are in the short story or in story form. I mean, you do have experimental stuff where you skip around like in a choose your own adventure, but your pieces are going to move. Your playthrough is going to change every time you run the scenario. Nothing's going to be exactly the same twice. So you have a lot more options that you have to write in for people. It's not going to be strictly linear in the way that you necessarily would do with a story as well. So you have to think in a lot of different directions when you're writing for the MR versus when you're writing a story.
Yeah, I love the idea of the terrifying possibilities of non-linear movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So coming from more of a short story or novel writing backstory in my own career, I when taking on the first and only MR scenario I've done, the idea that, the players, they're like, every player is a queen, they can move in any direction. And so you have to think about that, and I think that that's fascinating. Dave, what do you think?
Well, I'm really glad that Rina took the short story angle because I haven't written a short story in years. Years. I came to scenario writing from blogging about masks. I homebrewed games, but never sat down and actually written something. So I came to my first scenario that I wrote, which is not on the Miskatonic repository. It's in a vault somewhere that Chaosium has, and it is it, it's a creation that I make in terms of I have an idea of what I want to happen at the table, but when I write my scenario, I know it's not my story. It's something that I've produced, but the protagonists are not mine to control. These are the characters, and I'm going to write this with the intention of handing it off to someone else for them to finish the story. And so, what I want to do when I approach writing a scenario is what is going to be fun? What are the people at the table going to find fun? And that allows me to think about the story, but also think about ways to blow up the story and open avenues for people to sort of explore in the space and create opportunities for them to create their own story. I do think that from the blogging standpoint, I think it's different because blogging is much more personal, whereas writing a scenario it's a much more technical procedure. You, as Rina alluded to, you have to have, there are rules that we have to follow. There are the rules of the game that we have to follow, and there are expected structures. And with a blog or even a short story, those words can just flow, and you don't have to worry about how someone's going to interpret them. That's just what I've put out there. So I think, like, in actually writing scenarios, it's more of a time consuming process. At least that's my experience. Now, Rina may have a completely different experience because she definitely seems to be able to. I'm sorry, they seem to be able to get them out there. So, I think it's great, and I love the Miskatonic repository because it's vastly easier than writing a short story, which is something that I would love to do. It's much easier to get it out to an audience and get exposure and feedback to what you create in writing scenarios and publishing them on the Miskatonic repository. So those are just some of my thoughts.
Okay, I have a follow up for Rina. So
Mhm.
I'd like to know if you could get a little scenario specific with some of the things that you've done, and how have you taken that approach to writing scenarios? How have you taken the idea that they differ from short stories or novellas or whatnot? How have you taken that and applied it to a scenario that you've written? Can you pick one out amongst your vast repertoire of published pieces? Evidently, the Library of Congress, which is under your feet.
Not quite that prolific, but so when it comes to things that are similar in how I approach short stories, like, for example, A Long Day's Night, which is my mobster scenario, there is a very specific set structure that you follow. It is very much linear storytelling. There's not a whole lot of sandboxiness. I approached it from here's the beginning, here's the end, here's a couple places in the middle. You might flip which one you go to first, but in general, you're going A, B, C, D. And so it was very much in story structure in my brain. And it's one of the few scenarios where I've actually done it that way. Generally, I have a lot more places you can wander around. But in that one, I very much thought of it in story structure when I was creating it. When it comes to differences in how I approach creating for the MR versus creating for short stories, when I write a short story, I tend to think in a very linear process. I tend to think of, here's how I'm starting. Okay, I write the start. Here's where I'm going next. Here's where I'm going next. I have to do it in a very linear way, and I know that's true for a lot of people. You have to go from in points of causality, right? A causes B, causes C. When it comes to my scenarios, I tend to start with a beginning and an ending, and then figure out what happens in the middle. And so the approach is very different there. My first scenario, Saturday the 14th, was very much that. I knew where I started, I knew where I ended, and then I had no idea what the hell was going to happen in the middle of it. And I actually wrote, I think, the last third of it in my brain before I went back and wrote the first third, and then the middle just kind of happened based on what I wrote in the first act and the third act. So it's a very different process when it comes to short story writing and Miskatonic repository scenarios for me.
Okay. So I'm going to give this question to Dave first. And, as we like to do, we like to make sure that we keep things lively. Dave, what makes a scenario compelling? Not as a writer, but as a reader, like when you open up someone else's written material and you go through it and you see the summary or the premise or perhaps even the dramatic persona, the cast of NPCs that you might get to inhabit as a keeper. What what draws you to that for people in the audience or in the the electronic YouTube land afterwards who might be watching this and saying, "Hey, I'm getting ready to write my first scenario. I'm worried that people aren't going to be interested in it." What is something that you would find as a reader that would be compelling?
Well, I would step back and just address the last thing that you said. If somebody feels like what they're about to do is compelling, then they should absolutely do it, because that's the most important part, right? So when I'm thinking about writing my own scenarios, like I want to write something that's going to be fun for me. Like that's number one priority, is like, because one, I like to run all my scenarios and I like to run them a lot. So, and that's a shortcoming of mine, in that I like to play my own stuff, but that's kind of how I approach it. Is like, if is this going to be fun for me to run? If it's not going to be fun for me, then I don't want to do it. And then that goes into answering your question, which is, that's a great question. And I would say that I'm kind of hard to please. Like I really want, one, I want good writing. I enjoy good writing, and I want to read something that's entertaining. And I think that Call of Cthulhu in particular is different, because I can pick up a OSR scenario and like there's some, it's very dense, and when it's well put together, you've got really nice descriptions, but they're brief. But in Call of Cthulhu, the convention is it is typically longer, and there's more prose and there are more paragraphs. But I want to be entertained by that. I really want a cool concept, and it doesn't have to be like super bespoke history. Like I think it just has to be something that's neat and interesting and grabs me. As I've already alluded to, I love Alex's Grindhouse stuff. It's really cool. And I don't think, and I want to say this like very clearly, nothing wrong with getting tropey and using stuff that is very common, because that's what we're here for. For me, particularly, I love horror because it's a genre that like you can just keep going back to that well. So, and I want something that's going to make interesting and chaotic situations at my table. That really grabs me a lot. I want to read something and be like, this is going to be wild. And my players are going to have a wild time with this, and I'm going to have a wild time with this. It's not Miskatonic repository, but I'm currently running Impossible Landscapes, and I read that and I'm like, this is going to be crazy. I have no idea how this is going to turn out, and that's what I really want to see at my table. Also, I'm a real sucker for stage magic. So if any scenario has stage magic in it, I'm sold 100% in.
All right, folks, you know how to get Keeper Doc now. Just put a little stage magic in your scenario, and that's a sale. That's something to think about. Okay, so we'll pivot to you, Rina. Tell me what makes a scenario compelling to read, and then where do you align or differ from Doc's perspective on it?
I find the touchstones that are referenced in a scenario to help with making it compelling for me. Like a lot of people will in their keeper info put what are some things you can read or listen to be inspired by, what are some things that inspired this scenario. And if I find something that's really interesting or something that I know really well in those touchstones, I immediately go, yes, this is fun. This is going to be really interesting. This is going to be something that I enjoy. Like when I wrote Saturday the 14th, it was obviously slasher movies. Like that was my touchstone because I freaking love slasher movies. They're a large chunk of my personality for some reason. There's nothing to be worried about, nothing to be concerned about in that. But I've had people tell me that the touchstone there of the slasher movie and the idea of playing with the slasher movie genre, that touchstone is compelling for them when they picked up the scenario without knowing me, without knowing anything about me, or buying it just because I wrote it. They saw it, went slasher movies, and they picked it up. And that's something that's I find compelling. Is what are those touchstones I can relate to? It's also going to help me run the scenario better, which is instantly going to make the scenario more approachable, I think, because I've got the basis there, those ideas of where you're coming from. But I also find the NPCs to be a large part of what draws me in and makes a scenario compelling. Like, do you have an interesting cast for your supporting characters? Because a large part of what's going to be compelling for your players is how they can interact with those NPCs. Do you give me a wide variety of people to play with, even if the players aren't going to necessarily interact with all of them? Do I have a good number of really interesting people? What are their quirks? What are their foibles? What is their purpose in the scenario? So I go looking at the NPCs to get an idea of where the scenario is going to go and how it's going to play. And that's a large part of what makes a scenario compelling for me is that cast of characters. I love a good quirky character, whether it's good quirky, bad quirky, weird quirky, whatever. That's what I'm personally drawn to.
Okay. Yeah,
That's great. I hadn't even thought of that. That's fantastic.
I think that I want to circle back really quick to something David mentioned at the beginning of his answer for this question. I completely agree with you that you should write for something that you want to play or read. I think that there's a really, really big pothole for any writer out there if you're writing for the audience, because ultimately it's just not going to be fulfilling, and people should do what they're passionate about specifically and show that through their writing to draw people to it rather than saying, what does the Miskatonic repository audience, what do they want writ large, right? I think that's dangerous. I have a couple other questions. I think I'll drill onto them later, but I think I want to step slightly to the side and talk about something adjacent to the repository when it comes to scenario creation, but I think you both have had to deal with it. With the, we'll just say, prevalence of generative pieces, I won't call them art because that's not what they are. Even though the AI generative pieces have been banned from the repository and basically drive through at large, for the most part. My question is how important is art and art placement in a scenario for you, especially specifically cover art? That's the either.
Cover art's important for me. Sorry.
Yeah,
Cover art draws me in, right? They say don't judge a book by its cover, but a lot of us do. Like a part of what makes a book appealing is cover art. So I won't turn down a scenario or not read it just because the cover isn't necessarily interesting. But when I'm going looking for a new scenario, if I'm on the prowl, so to speak, the ones that are going to grab my attention are going to be the ones that have interesting covers. Like, Doc, your scenario has an amazing cover. Like, that is a fantastic piece of cover art. It draws me in instantly. And there's multiple scenarios on the Miskatonic repository that just have that kind of knack to them. That I look at the front page and go, or the cover page and go, okay, one, I know something about the scenario from this, and two, it tempts me. I want to be drawn in by this piece of art. Inside art, I'm not as picky about, to be completely honest. I've used public domain stuff for several of my scenarios. I know a lot of people do. We can't all afford to pay a lot of money for fantastic interior art, and also public art is there. Public domain art is there for us to use, and pictures and all of that. So I'm not as picky about that. But the cover, I'm really drawn in by the cover.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I mean, first of all, I love, that's one of my favorite things about creating stories, in particular RPG products, because there's such great creatives working in the space, and there's so much enthusiasm. And the Swamp Song cover was happened because an artist reached out to me asking me about doing a cover, and I was thrilled that he was interested in doing a cover for me, and we worked together and collaborated on this idea. And it's fun because it's an opportunity to both of you have a say in something that gets created. I wrote the scenario, but the cover sort of represents the scenario, as Rina was alluding to. This is how the world sees it. And working with Tom Brown on the cover for Swamp Song was amazing. And he was like, "We could do." I decided to just like pull out all the stops. I wanted it to be a wraparound cover, and I wanted to really see as much as I could of it. And for me, it's like I had him send me the art, and it's going to hang on my wall. The cover that we have for Deliver Us from Evil that Alex put together, he generated it or created it through Photoshop using found images. And I mean, he's the best at that as far as I'm concerned. And he really captured the tone. And that's kind of like what my goal was in collaborating with him, is finding somebody that captures the tone of the work. I'm going to go back to work with Tom. Matt, Doc, Tracy, and I are going to do a cover with Tom for our next scenario that we're going to put out. It's just fun to find people that really like to work on this, and then you can do something that's just neat and beyond my expectations. Like, I love it. Like, that's one of my favorite parts. I wish I could be an artist, but like I can't. So I like to work with them and sort of share the process a little bit.
Yeah,
James
absolutely.
Bennell, or James from the Old Ways, is an amazing artist. He's done all of my covers for the scenarios I've written on my own, and they've all been fantastic. Like, just having someone who can almost look into my brain and pull out that image. He's also doing all the interior art this time for Friends of Dorothy, which I'm extremely excited about. Actual art pieces, not just stuff I've pulled from the internet, which is going to be phenomenal. But like Doc was saying, having someone who can really look in and just pull all of those pieces and just make your vision come to life in an image form for the cover, I can't recommend that highly enough. Find someone you click with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I I think that when you look at covers, especially when it comes to scenario covers, I look at I look at a lot of the past the stuff I grew up playing, the games I grew up playing, and the art on those covers, stuff from Jeff Easley and stuff from any number of amazing artists that were part of the wave of second edition D&D artists. Those are there. It's imagery that makes you think. That's what gets me. Is I look at an image and I go, what's happening there? What could happen there? What happens next? Why is this like this? Or just something to that effect. And I think that is back to the idea of making something compelling. It is being able to draw an audience in, not through necessarily written material, but something that will get them to take it off the proverbial electronic shelf and go, okay, well, I wonder what's in here. That's really what you're looking for. And I can't say enough good things about the artistic community that sort of surrounds the repository and is available if you would just call on them. And I think that that's one thing that doesn't get spoken about enough, which is the repository has a list of creatives who will do work for you or will help you, right? And I think that collective is super important, right? Because I'm much like the folks here where I couldn't draw to save my life. Like it just wouldn't happen. But there are people who can, and they're very good at it. And what they want to know they want to know that they have a creative outlet as well, right? And I think it's fair to pay for art. And I think also that the only way the community betters one another is that sort of exchange of talent, right? Like that artist may have something that they want to do themselves in the repository, but maybe they're not a writer. And you can get that collaborative community from the repository where You can see authors who have gotten together. It happens a ton too on the Johnstown Compendium side. We're having, as was just announced today, we're having a chat next week with some of those creators, and you can go through the list of things that they've created, and 4 or 5 of them are all attached to so many different projects because they have learned that, okay, I'm really good at this, and this person's really good at this, and let's let them control like sort of their piece of this puzzle and let everybody do what they're good at and then bring it together and then have some sort of editorial control, layout that gets controlled. Somebody's got to take all those puzzle pieces and go, hey, hang on, wait a minute. We have to form this into something that can actually be look at by a 8x11. It can't be some sort of weird, crazy shape. So layout is super important, which leads me to that question, which is when we talk about book layout, what is your advice to people when they lay their book out? Font sizes, columns, etc., border art. Where do you go?
I go
I'll
to
answer
someone
that.
else.
Yeah, I think that's my answer too. I didn't like I have my skill that I mean my alleged skill is that I write and I pay somebody else to do the rest. But and that kind of goes to what you were saying, Mike, is that I can collaborate with people, or there are people that will barter services. So if I help somebody with a play test and go through some proofreading, they may edit my scenario as an exchange. Someone may just be willing to collaborate with you and do layout, and you give them a share of the profits. And there are all sorts of ways to make it work because people want to work together. And like the fun thing is that you get your name on the product. And you're helping someone else get their product out there, and they may just do the same for you. It's like you said, it's a collaborative community. There's a lot of people that are interested in helping you, and I actually hilariously I downloaded, I bought the Affinity package, and I downloaded it today. I was like, maybe I'll give this a shot, but until I know what I'm doing, I don't want to waste my time because I have a limited amount of time to do this stuff. I don't want to waste my time futzing around trying to get the fonts and columns right.
Yeah. No, totally. Rena?
Yeah, I did the layout on my first 2 scenarios, Saturday the 14th and Safe Space, and or 3 because Click Clack was in there as well. And then I was just super excited, and I was thrilled that I was writing, and it wasn't even crossing my mind fancy layout or anything. I just wanted people to read my scenarios, and then I went back after my first one that I had professionally done and went, oh no,
Oh,
ouch. This hurts to look at. So I've had all of them redone except Safe Space. I have someone. Sometimes it's for trade, like Doc was saying. I'll offer to proofread or edit people's stuff, or co-write with them if they're struggling on particular pieces of their scenarios or whatever, and they'll do layout for me. Some people I pay, but don't put yourself through the ringer if layout stresses you out, or if you're really struggling with it. Sanity has a price, as my mother-in-law likes to say. So if it is really driving you up a wall, there are so many people in that directory that Mike mentioned who will be more than happy to work with you, whether it's through a barter or through payment, whatever it is, and they are very good at it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I could probably name a handful off the top of my head, but I don't want to name check folks here without their direct consent, as it were. But I do think that it's a salient point when we talk about utilizing the tools that are around you. And you just said something, Rena, that I think I want to drill down on really quick. Having been in the trenches when it comes to writing, whether it be novels or scenarios, there's a point where you're going to potentially reach a stress point where you feel like you have to push through. And other people around you might be telling you, hey, just push through and just do it. You need to realize that there's a cost for doing that. And that the cost of doing that could be very much a type of personal sanity that you lose to a project. And yes, we're in a medium here where it's easy to talk about sanity loss because it's part of Call of Cthulhu. But it really needs to be said that it's okay to put something down and wait a couple of days or wait a week until you have the time and space to do it, and not put yourself under a self-imposed deadline where you feel you must perform. Because unless this is your sole path of income, it isn't something you must do, it's something you want to do, but self-care in the writing circle is super important too, because you can't put out the best material if you're not prepared mentally and even physically to do those things.
I started Friends of Dorothy in July of last year, and it's a very important scenario to me. It has a lot of very deep, resonating themes and a lot of stuff that I relate to personally. And so I hit a point around September where I could not push myself further because it was emotionally causing me distress. Just I couldn't get the words on paper. I was struggling to actually put things down. I couldn't form sentences, which is rare for me. And I just had to say, okay, I do not have to do this right now. It is important and I want to do it, but my brain is saying, no, we are going to break if you keep trying to do this right now. So I stepped away until December. And now I have a fully written scenario since then, been fully play tested, almost ready to go. And it's so much better because I stopped when my brain was saying, nope, 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 nope. You do not have to force yourself. You'll have a better product if you don't force yourself, in fact.
Yeah, it's really important advice that folks take. Let me ask you both about NPCs, non-player characters, folks who fill up our scenario and interact with the investigators as they move through the story. I wonder, is there such thing as too many NPCs?
I think there are as many NPCs as the players and their characters want to interact with. So, and I think some of that is writing them into the story, but as a keeper, right, and playing on the fly, sometimes there's somebody that they want to talk to that hasn't even been written into the scenario. And that is right. We've all experienced so you always have to be prepared for that. It's interesting too, because I'm kind of I sometimes I'll write more NPCs into the scenario, but will not give them like a header in the dramatis personae, because I like to have more people they interact with, but I don't want to have to create an entire person and stat block from that. So I think when you increase the cognitive load for the keeper by generating a bunch of NPCs that you have to remember a lot of information about, that's one thing. But if you have points of interaction that are discrete, like there's a bellhop that you meet at the hotel. He has a name, you give him a name, but he doesn't have anything else to define him. Then that allows the keeper to sort of use that as they can do whatever they want. It's a lump of NPC clay that you've given them. So I think my answer is no, but I can't write all those NPCs. But when I'm at the table, I like making them up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are several campaigns that exist within both the Call of Cthulhu setting and then Delta Green also, where there are we'll just say a fairly heavy load of NPCs that one is expected to remember as a keeper and understand all of their different machinations, and so that can be, I think, a little bit troublesome occasionally when games go a little bit longer. But Rina, the question to you is there such a thing as too many NPCs?
If Rena's thinking, I just have one comment about the too many NPCs in that particular campaign. That is exactly the situation where they're going to go out and try to find more NPCs that are not in the book, right? That is the exact campaign where you're going to have to create a whole slew of NPCs because it's a big world. Sorry.
No, you're okay. I think Rina may have froze. That's okay. Oh, yep, there goes Zoom. All right, so what we're going to do is we're just about at 45 minutes. I'm going to run a real quick ad and then we're going to hopefully get back in. So stay tuned.
Behave, Zoom.
Oh, look at that. We're totally in the wrong boxes, but we're back. So what I'm going to do
Where am I?
We're going to do something called a playful tap dance. And we're going to tap dance a little bit. And as we do that, I'm going to fix what's wrong. So you'll see us move around a bit, but that's okay. So don't worry about it. Rena, tell us about
Mhm.
tell us about Saturday the 14th, because
Mhm.
you're in the box you're supposed to be in,
Oh, hooray!
right?
I've returned. So Saturday the 14th is my homage to slasher flicks. It is a sequel to Friday the 13th, quote unquote. Not the actual movie, but the idea of the movie, where a group of investigators from a police force are called in to clean up the scene of the crime after the slasher has left. So the slasher has come in, murdered a bunch of camp counselors, and the next morning, crime scene investigation team has to come in, clean it up, and figure out exactly what happened, with very disastrous results. There's a
Fantastic.
lot of there's a lot of tropes in it from the movies because like I said, I really love the movies. They're some of my favorites. Friday the 13th is one of my top 5 favorite films. So it is very much a love letter to slasher films.
Cool. All right. I think most of that is fixed now. It might look a little weird, but you know how it is, kids. Darn Zoom. Okay. So thanks for sticking with us through the break. I appreciate it. We are talking with a couple of Miskatonic repository authors tonight on the stream, and I have some more questions, as you might imagine, because I am a man with questions, many questions. So, what's your approach when it comes to building a scenario? When you're taking it from a seed, right, to that treehouse others get to play around in, would you consider it like a spark of inspiration, or is it riffing on a particular story that you're familiar with already and you're basically trying to remix it? Take us away, Dave.
Um, see, that's a great question. And I think it just, my answer is going to suck. It depends. I'm so open to lots of different types of information, inspiration. But I would say, like, if I were to pick one thing that inspires me the most, it is place. I get really into an idea of running a scenario in a particular location. And when I do that, I kind of think about how can I build something on top of this that's really interesting. And that's when I usually bring in like a horror or mythos element. And that was how it worked with Swamp Song. I really want to write a scenario that takes place in New Orleans, which is a classic Call of Cthulhu location. Um, I'm a big fan of the Pacific Northwest, and that my latest scenario is set there. I wrote 4 scenarios set in Detroit, so I really get into a place, and I really kind of want to explore the place and build something around it. So I find neat locations in those places to hang a scenario around. But sometimes I just get a really cool idea, and I want to run with that too, like a concept or a hook. Usually, in terms of building it out, it all starts as that first idea, and then it's usually going to be a rough outline. And for me, because again, I hang so much on place, it usually involves creating a very rough map of what I want to use as locations in my scenario, because I kind of everything I like to have is a kind of a movable sandbox. Now, the latest scenario I've done is a little bit more linear, and that was on purpose because all my other scenarios I try to avoid that. It's a structure that I don't like. But I kind of just pick a bunch of locations and then fill them in with cool scenes.
I like that. That's a cool method. Rena?
I tend to be very inspired by pop culture. So a book, a movie, a line of dialogue, a song. Like Jolene is obviously a riff on the song by Dolly Parton because I was listening to the song as I was walking on the beach one day, and I went, "What if Jolene but mythos?" Right? Friends of Dorothy, my upcoming LGBTQ scenario, is based on that phrase, the Friends of Dorothy. What if I took Friends of Dorothy in the 1980s, these queer service members in the US military, and put them in a mythos situation. So that's where my ideas tend to spark is a song or a movie or a book or something that just sparks an idea of what if this but mythos. And then I run with it from there.
Mm.
When it comes to the actual writing, I have what I've been told is a now infamous method of 3 bullet points on a napkin, because that's how Saturday the 14th started. Was I had the idea for aftermath of slasher film, but mythos, and then I wrote 3 things down on a napkin because I literally had a napkin. I was at a coffee shop, and then I said, "Okay, I'm going to play test this and see what happens." So I knew what the starting premise. And then as I built the pre-gens, I thought I knew how it was going to end once they got there eventually. And then I improved the entire storyline from once they got to the camp. With my playtesters in there, I picked a group of people who I knew were very strong on improving things and looking into things and investigating and all of that. And so I just threw them into the setting I'd created and let them have at it. And I improvised the details, I improvised the NPCs, all of it from start to finish. And
Nice.
then I ran it a few more times with the ideas that I'd built from that very first playthrough. And then by the end of playtest 4, I had a very solid idea. I knew what was happening. I knew who the NPCs were. I knew what all the different branches of actions were, and I could write it. And that's basically what I've done with everything except Friends of Dorothy. Friends of Dorothy is the first scenario I've written down of my own, start to finish, before playtesting it. It was a very strange way of doing things for me.
Interesting. I like to hear
I,
that there's variation there. That's good. Yeah, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, I just remember Rina telling me this and just being floored and blown away that this was how they approach scenario writing. And I'm inspired by it. I really want to try something like that, but I am the exact opposite. I like to try to write everything down and constrain myself and sort of have an idea of what the narrative is going to be like before I sit down at the table. So it's just impressive to have that sort of free space to explore your idea.
I think it's probably
The reason.
a lot easier
Mm-hmm.
when you have a group of players who are good at improv around you,
Mm-hmm.
and you can
Absolutely.
sort of tell them that there are no rules in effect. The story can go wherever you take it. This is also dangerous depending upon your group of players,
Yes.
because you could get totally far left of field, and then maybe the playtest isn't as valuable to you as a writer. Because fun is one thing, but you're gathering people together for several hours, and the idea in effect is to get some sort of actionable, feedback about what you think and what they think and how they, felt about the scenario itself.
I think
Which is why.
kind of, go ahead, please.
Which is why I have the 3 bullet points. Usually they can be just words or a full sentence. It depends on the scenario, but it gives me 3 things that I know I want to have no matter what. So even when they start going into wild places, I can direct things a little bit back to, well, I know I want this to happen, or I know I want this NPC in there. So it's not 100% complete chaos with a start and an end. There are a couple things in there. I just don't outline completely all the way because having played enough before I wrote my first scenario, I went, people never do the thing you think they're going to do. If I sit down and write this whole thing, they're just going to go in a completely different direction, and all my writing time will have been wasted, and I hate wasting time. So I figured I'll just let them do the time wasting up front, and then we'll see what happens with it.
Exactly. And with that in mind, that was kind of what I did with the last scenario that I wrote when thinking about the conversations that we've had. And I was like, I got into a point where I was like, I need to see what happens here. And I need to see what the players do, and then I need to write it on that basis. So you're absolutely right. And it goes back to that whole, like, the collaborative storytelling. Like, it's just amazing that part of your writing process is, and creative process in writing those types of scenarios, is collaborative with your players. Like, they are helping you craft the scenario, which again is like, you have very skilled improvisationally oriented players, which makes it a lot easier. If you're playing with a bunch of chaos Muppets, then it can be a little challenging.
Oh, who doesn't like a good chaos Muppet now and again? But it isn't always useful. We've probably all ran into players where players normally don't do the thing that you expect them to do, but there are also players who are like that, where they'll do something that is completely far afield, or they'll do nothing at all and be like, oh yeah, my character's just gonna sit down. And I don't find that a lodestone at all. I like that. Like, you want to stop in your tracks and do nothing. Okay, well, at least you're standing still, and so you're easy to get to. But I wonder if we're taking the idea of the differences in scenarios. There is something that I mentioned sort of in our pre-meeting before the stream about something Mark Twain said. Right, he's quoted, maybe accurately or not, that there's no such thing as a new idea, and that the stories we craft are our own really innovations or perspective on those things. Do you believe that there are no original ideas left?
Yes, I'm happy to believe that, and I will say that my experience in coming up with something just in the process of trying to brainstorm things that I want to write about or ideas that I have floating around in the back of my head, I have then come across it in reviewing older scenarios that have already been written or stories that have been written. And when I see that, I initially was distraught because I was like, well, someone's already done this. But the reality is that it is liberating because it doesn't matter. Like, I'm okay with that because I know that it's not the idea itself, it's the synthesis and the creation that you put out there, right? So somebody could write a scenario that involves the deep ones and family, right? And that there are actually a number of those because it's a great Call of Cthulhu trope at this point, right? Which is established. We're backing up just a little bit. We're all playing to some extent, depending upon what we use as our source material, in Howard's sandbox that he created. We're playing a game called Call of Cthulhu. So there is some sort of limitation. Now, you can step outside of that and do things like Saturday the 14th, and or you can bring in other creators to the mythos circle, but you're still kind of playing in the world of cosmic horror to some degree. So that is one thing that's going to, if you want to sort of lean on the things that people are expecting to get from Call of Cthulhu, then there are a limited number of ideas, right? What I want to do is I want to take something that is been out there and maybe somebody had the exact same idea, but I want to put a different spin on it, and that's what's fun. And again, it's because it's my own thing. I don't really worry about it. I'm not, and I think that is sort of like, to a broader point, is like the freedom from judgment, right? I don't, as someone who's writing stuff, I don't want somebody to be like, well, somebody came up with that idea, so I'm not going to read that. If that's how they feel, then they don't need to buy it. But if they read it and they're like, wow, that was more fun than the one that I've heard of before, then that's great. And that's kind of what I'm aiming for, is I want to do something that's original, even if the idea itself is not.
Yeah, I think there's even space to look at other writers that perhaps Howard was interacting with at the time, and look to some inspirations by them. Right, I can think of a gentleman that lived in Texas who was quite the prolific writer before he left us, and I drew some inspiration from that when it came to my own scenario of the idea of there being, things deep within the earth, and and how someone might interact with one of them. I'm very much a fan of the sort of swords and sorcery, old school, Hyperborean tales. I think they're really interesting, and I think they can be upcycled and changed and looked at from a modern lens too. But that is probably another question which we should get to at some point, which is eras of play. I wrote that down today, and I thought we should talk about eras, and like the expressed eras that are commonplace, like the three that we all know, which are most people would know, which would be Gaslight, and the classic era, and then also modern era. But before we do, we are about to get an ad. And so, as we would normally do on Twitch, we have to, submit to the dystopian capitalist society that we live in, and we do so by Twitch ads. And so, when that ad starts, we'll sort of pause for a moment, and then we'll let the ad play through, and so people don't miss any content. And if you're one of our amazing subscribers, then while this ad plays right now, you're seeing us still. And so I don't want to miss a ton of content, but I would love to hear if you're in chat with us and you're a subscriber. Like, what do you think? Are there any specific questions you have for our guests here that we can get answered for you? Let me know. And now we're going to hydrate. Because hydration is important. Just like sleep is important. Sleep, like you're a carbon-based life form. If you're out there watching this, then you certainly need to ingest water and eventually rest. Just saying. Oh, questions.
Ooh.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know me. You know why and how. Who the hell? That's a great question. I want to ask that second question first. Who the hell do you think you are? I don't know. I really don't. Don't expect me to know. Oh, all right. So we'll be back in about 30 seconds or so from our ads. Hopefully, I've subscribing to the channel has saved you from another ad for Tide Pods or Buffalo Wild Wings or whatever it is that they're showing here on Twitch at the moment. And your subscription, by the way, if you're a subscriber watching this, is vastly appreciated. It's another way to support the show and the things that we do, and that is that. So the ads are gone, and everyone is back. So I want to ask the eras question. What's your favorite era to write for? And I'm not going to hem you into Gaslight, Classic, or Modern, right? Because one of the other sort of scenario ideas that I'm writing or have playtest a couple times is actually in the 70s, because I love the 70s for whatever reason. Everything, even though everything was brown, I think the 70s were fun. But what's your favorite era to write for?
So I've written for a bunch of different eras, including Gaslight. I've got a Down Darker Trails scenario in the works. I've done the 50s, I've done the 80s, I've done modern day, and it's hard to say which one my favorite is, but I think I really like writing for more recent times. Once technology starts coming in and affecting how people are going to interact with the world, that really interests me. Like one of the conceits in Jolene is that everyone meets on a subreddit. That's how the investigators are drawn together. They don't know each other. They met on a subreddit, and are drawn together through meeting in this particular place. But it's also a lot more familiar to me. Obviously, it's a lot more recent. Even when I'm writing in the, a little bit further back, before I came into existence, say the 70s and the 80s, there's people I can talk to who remember that era, who can give me the flavor of that era, who can fact check things. I can run something by them, which I've done on multiple occasions, for several of my scenarios. But I think I find the more recent decades more compelling. There's been a lot that's happened, and there's a lot more in how we interact with the world when it comes to technology and things of that nature that I find very interesting. You don't have to go to the library necessarily to look up information. You've got your phone, that you can pull stuff up on. And how does that affect how we interact? You can call people. It's funny when people try calling the police immediately, which they can do more readily now in modern era scenarios than you could necessarily in the 1920s. Just all sorts of things you can work with that I personally find very interesting. So I'd say more modern era is probably my favorite.
Okay, Dave.
Tough call, and I'm gonna probably give like 4 or 5 different answers, but I mean, I really do love classic era, and in particular, I like the late 20s and the pulp era. I just think there's a lot of great stuff going on there. The end of Prohibition, the Great Depression. There's a lot of stuff that you can play with, and it's a very familiar environment too, and that's where a lot of these stories were set. So there's that initial answer, and this the majority of scenarios that I have written are in that setting. So there's another piece of it. 2 things that I would like to see. I would and that I would like to create for myself is I kind of like in the vein of 70s 80s. I want 90s. Like that's like when I was a teenager and a middle schooler, and there's some just amazing stuff and like teenagers. Yeah, I want to do like teenagers and college kids in the 90s, and I just feel like there's a lot of fun stuff that you can do there, but there's just not a lot out there. And veering off the MR, I ran Running Impossible Landscapes for Delta Green, which kicks off in the 90s, and my players were just really into it. We were, and a number of us grew up in the 90s, and it was just very compelling. You know, we made playlists. We got into the fashion. People dressed up when we played. It was just so much fun, and that's just kind of where I'm at. If I'm playing modern era, this is just me, and we're talking about the MR, but I love Delta Green, and that's my Cthulhu modern setting that I prefer. But the last thing that I'd like to see, I would, in kind of going back to what you mentioned about Robert E. Howard, I love Clark Ashton Smith and his Averoigne region, the southeastern France, the mythos that he created there with a lot of his short stories, Sathagua and all that other stuff. Like that is such a rich environment that I would really like to see. And that's a setting that I think could be just amazing, and I would really like to play in that and create in that space.
Oh, it could be interesting for sure. So a question in chat here from Speed Racer 77. I'm seeing a lot more 1970s, 1980s scenario in the MR lately. Do you think Chaosium will ever give us a source book? So I wouldn't presume to speak for what Chaosium may or may not do. Do I think that they would? I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. I think that a while back, of course, there was Cthulhu Now, which was basically the 1990s, but it was created during that time. I think that the big pull, obviously, is Gaslight. That's in like the immediate future for folks playing Call of Cthulhu. It is something that people are going to get a lot of work out of. A lot of people have been banging on their door for a new Gaslight book for a real long time, and they know that. But they're also, if nothing else, at least in the, we'll just say, newer era of Chaosium, they have been very selective about the things that they publish. And I think that's because they want to do things the right way most of the time. I have my own opinions about some of the products that have been released, but we'll save that for another time. Do I think they would do a 70s book? I could see like an era book, right? Where maybe they might put together multiple eras where they could do like I don't want to say greatest generation, but you could do like a Call of Cthulhu, Boomer Generation Edition, where they sort of riff on the idea of that generation, and they're. But I could see different eras of play. I think the thing I would like to see them do is address the future. Like give me Cthulhu, 2100. Give me something that's far future would be fun. Sort of speculative. That is a thing that the thing that I asked the creators, most of the creators from Delta Green, when I had them on the Patreon, I asked them why they don't create stuff in the future, and basically the answer was, we're already struggling enough to ingest the horrors which real life is giving us for the past 5 or 10 years, let alone imagine horrors in the future. So I think that sort of probably is the same, some of the same issue that the folks at Chaosium might have, is that there's so many things they could do. They have to think about what is going to sell, right? And that is maybe sometimes difficult for us to ingest as folks who buy their product, but they're a company. And so their purpose is to be able to sustain themselves. And they have more than just Call of Cthulhu, right? So obviously the Pendragon is out for them now. And then the RuneQuest is getting a whole line, series of lines of books. And so they're putting a lot of their efforts into that. And those are great, by the way. But I'd love to see them plug more era books. I think that you could do them as smaller pieces. And so the lift might be different. Maybe in the vein of like the RuneQuest cult books, right? So they're not over like 100 or 125 pages, but you have great art from the era. You have a couple of scenarios inside of it, a breakdown of like, let's just say the rough geopolitical situation of the era, right? A timeline, all easy stuff to do. I know it sounds a lot like a Delta Green book because it kind of is. But also, you can have in there what cults are doing during that time, right? Maybe you have an entire thing in the 50s where they talk about, or 40s or 50s, where they talk about the aftermath of what happens after masks. And they can say, oh, yeah, if your players played through masks, here's a scenario where, they're 20 years older and these certain NPCs rear their ugly head again because you didn't really actually stop anything. You only kept it at bay for a little while. So love to get your thoughts on their questions about would Chaosium do a 70s book?
Gosh. I mean, I know I don't know specifically if that's something in their pipeline, but I do know that they have a lot of material in their pipeline. I do know from talking to other people that there's a 50s book. But I think the question is, what do we want an era a source book for? Do we want it as inspiration for writing scenarios? Do we want it for reference, or do we want it because we want more 70s scenarios? Because like I would posit that there are amazing 70s scenarios out there already on the Miskatonic repository. And I think that's one of the interesting things that I've seen is that if people want to see those source books, they can create them. I didn't know that was something that people were going to do, but the Japan source book that was created recently, that is a publication that's incredible, and it offers a lot of material for somebody to use as a reference to create their own stuff. So I think if people are really interested in doing that, they should look and see if there are others that would be willing to collaborate and create something, because Chaosium's got a lot of stuff. And I don't know all that they have, but I can tell you that they're very interested in Lovecraft country. We saw the first Arkham book, and we're going to get a lot of Lovecraft country. And I think if people want era source books, I think that people should collaborate, band together, and try to create that project. Like I said, I'm very interested in the 90s. And that's something that I've kind of entertained myself. Is like, would there be a group of people that would be interested in writing this source book together and putting some scenarios into it? Because that is exactly what this space is for. Yeah, creating things that we want to see.
All right, Rina, what do you think? 70s or perhaps another era that might be interesting?
I mean, I'd love to see an 80s source book personally. That's something I find very interesting. But I was just going to say what Keeper Doc said, which is the best way to get those is to collaborate on a source book and to make the source book, because there's so many things you can pull together. There's so many people with different viewpoints on that era. If you're working with people who actually lived through it, or people who've done heavy research into that era, whatever era it is you want to be working on, that you can get a really interesting book put together for the Miskatonic repository that will incorporate everything you're looking for and will also bring those ideas out, those facets out for other people. So I think do it yourselves.
Yes,
Get together.
be the era that you want to see in the repository.
Be the source book you want to see in the world.
Well, no, I think it's really telling, right? I think that that is something that I hear as a clarion call when there are questions about, hey, they should do this, they should do this. They have given you the tools should you wish to wield them yourself. Maybe you can't fathom of how you would put a book like that together. And so I would just say to you, you could look to previously written era or geographical location books. Like the first one I would look at would be the Berlin book by David Larkins, which is fantastic. You could look at that and go, oh, well, I really want to see games set in, X city. I'd love to have a San Francisco source book. Okay, so can I, rip apart some of the outline that's presented here to give me general stakes in the ground for when I raise my tent, proverbially? Not literally, of course, because that won't get you on the repository. But I think that that's a great way to motivate people is listen, if you go out to the repository and use as I have seen recently on posts there and say whether in the Discord or whether in the Facebook group and you say, hey, I'm interested in doing X. Is anybody else interested? There are so many people who will probably respond, yes, I am interested. Because so many other creators feel the same thing you do, which is lifting it all by yourself is really heavy. So I would totally encourage you to get involved with others if you're looking to do a big, because obviously an era source book or a locational source book is going to take a lot more research. It's going to take a lot more text than say a 21 or 28 page scenario does. You're going to need a little bit more meat on that bone, so that way others can use it as a reference guide, because that's essentially what you're making. But it's a great question by Speed Racer, so thanks. I appreciate the interactivity here in chat.
I'll just say I have written a city source book for my own enjoyment, but for other purposes as well. And I will say that if somebody's interested in doing that, please reach out to me, because that is something that I know a little bit about, and also I'm pretty passionate about that, because as I mentioned, place is very important, and I want to make cool places that we can play. So if someone's interested in collaborating on those things, let me know. We did work on Hometown Horrors. That was something that was put together by Evan Perlman, and we did some people created a bunch of geographic locations, and it was sort of a proof of concept. It's pretty neat, but I would like to see something moving forward more fleshed out, and I would love to work with people on that.
Nice. Okay. So I want to circle back to the Mark Twain question, because there is a very important follow-up to that question. So Twain is reportedly has said that there's no such thing as a new idea. What I want to know is, if you believe that that is true, is there freedom in knowing that? Like, is there mental freedom in knowing, like, hey, if things have already been done, it's okay. I don't have to lift a completely new scenario or literary idea up and say, hey, I came up with something original, like after, the stacks of crumpled paper have basically buried you under your desk where you're trying to figure out what's new.
Takes a lot of pressure off, honestly, because there isn't that I must do something new. I must revolutionize the Miskatonic repository. I must bring people something they've never ever seen before. I think Keeper Doc you were talking about the main ideas might be the same, but you put your own spin on it. And I think just knowing that you don't have to create everything from scratch, you just have to put your own idea on it, your own spin on it. Like when I wrote Jolene, there was already a thing circulating around the internet where someone had rewritten the entire lyrics of the song to sing to Jolene as a hideous mythos creature. So that wasn't a whole brand new thing I came up with. It's just my idea about it is different. There's a lot of stuff involving loss and drug abuse and things like that I put into the scenario different from how they envisioned it, but there's still the idea of Jolene, but mythos. But I didn't have to deal with the pressure of this is a whole completely new thing. And whenever I approach my scenarios, I don't have to go into it thinking, okay, what is the brand new thing I'm going to do that nobody else has ever done? So I personally find the idea freeing.
Awesome. Dave?
Yeah, and I agree with that 100%. I feel like it's something that I can perseverate on, whether or not I'm taking somebody else's idea. But I think the best thing to do is just move forward with what's inspired me, and it's in the idea, and but it's really the execution, and sometimes taking other people's ideas, right? And some people will, like, this is classic RPG advice, which is just steal what you can, particularly when you're like trying to create a game at your table, right? And that's when I'm trying to come up with something at the table, I'm usually referencing something else, and the familiar is so much easier for players to imagine. So I think working with things that people have produced, there have been 2 scenarios that are based on The Haunting, right? And they're really neat. And I think that is a great way to explore your own style, is looking at how can you bring a different take to an old idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think mimicry as a sincere form of flattery is important when you are doing something like that. I think it's okay. Personally, as a creator, I don't know how the two of you feel, but I would imagine if someone said to you, "Hey, I listened to this scenario that you ran, or I watched this Twitch stream when you ran your scenario, and my next game session, I totally stole your idea and used it with players." It's immensely flattering. It mean it's and it's validating too as a creator, and so they're those things are great to hear when they do happen. And so I would tell people, as I have told people about stuff I did in Masks, or stuff I did in Impossible Landscapes, or stuff I did in OE, when they say, "Oh yeah, I listened to this and I just completely ripped it from my table." Great. I hope it worked really well. Don't think that it was completely and totally planned out. A lot of it's player interaction, how they interact with the scene, but take it. It's perfectly fine with me.
And I think, just thinking about what you just said, I think where I arrived at to scenario writing was I started writing about masks, something that I had, I was running it and I have run it, but it was not my work, but I've produced a lot of thoughts about something that I didn't create. But it's really fired my own creativity and brought me to a place where I could, learn a lot about my writing style and how I create scenarios and bring those into play at the table and in what I publish.
Okay. So we've talked about scenarios and sometimes how they're put together. We talked a little bit about how playtesting happens. At least the two of you have described it a little bit. I wonder how much is, how involved is playtesting and redrafting a part of your own creation process? And I just want to put this slight little addendum on this, and that is, I don't believe material should go anywhere unedited. I think very few, if any, writers in history are good enough to publish a piece that is unedited, meaning directly from their brain to paper or to text and then push send and publish. I think wholeheartedly you should engage editors, sensitivity readers, all that stuff to help get the product prepared for where it goes. But that's my diatribe, and I'll just put my soapbox away now. How much is playtesting and redrafting a part of the process for you, Rina?
Well, it's a huge part of it. I mean, it plays a large part in how I get the scenario written to begin with, as we've discussed. But once I've got the ideas down, the playtesting really helps me solidify places where things really work, but also fix things that don't work. Like, it helps me find the holes in it. And sometimes there's as many holes as in a sieve. But find the places where they don't go where I expect them to go. They go in a completely different direction. All right. Well, now I need to either create something to prevent that from happening in the scenario, or I need to write that additional location, NPC, whatever, as a potentials, like for keepers, like, hey, here's what might potentially happen. Or there's a plot hole that I never noticed, and someone invariably in playtest 6, if I get that far, will go, hey, what was the point of this? What was that? Why did this NPC give this information if it wasn't useful in the long run? Things like that. So playtesting really helps me find the places that are squishy, that really need some supporting, or places that are outright full of holes. And I wouldn't have those without the collaborative nature of the playtest, because when you're looking at your scenario yourself, you don't see those things necessarily because you know what should happen. You know what the story should look like. You know where things should go, where people should go, what pieces everyone needs to complete the puzzle, whatever it is. Someone else who doesn't know the story that's in your head and is playing it or reading it can go, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense to me. So it's very important to me to have playtesters to help me revise and finish up my drafts.
Okay, good to know. Dave?
Playtesting is extremely important, but I will admit that I am maybe a shortcoming. I probably play test my scenarios once or twice before I publish them. So Swamp Song, I wrote it and ran it, and it was good to go. And I play tested again just to make sure that it was okay. Death of Superstition, the first scenario I wrote, same thing. I wrote it completely all the way through and then play tested it. Both of those minimal tweaks. But there have been times when I've had to do a second round of play tests, and it usually stems from having to rework the hook. And one of the things that's important to me is I want to maximize my players' engagement in the scenario. So if it feels flat or things blow up at the start, we will call the session, and I will incorporate that immediate feedback and go back and rework the entire scenario from the beginning. And I've had to do that, I'd say 3 or 4 times of the 7 or so things that I've written. So I'm very open and receptive to feedback. And my regular group, the people that I play test all my scenarios with, they live to break my stuff. They love it. And they're very good at it, and it works really well because every time I do a first run play test, I know that it's going to get stress test very hard. And whenever I run stuff with them, I always apologize and I say, I'm sorry, you are getting to play the worst version of this scenario. And it's always memorable. Yeah. But I try not to play test over and over again because I don't want to torture myself with the details when I know that another keeper may, and I hope, injects their own vision into some of these things. So I try to give it some space to breathe. And also I want to get it out there. Once I've play tested it once or twice, I feel good about it. And then I will play it a lot after that. I like to play my scenarios. I run them at cons a lot. So I get to see how they work. And usually I'm pretty pleased with the way that they work. But playtesting is huge. And going back to what you said about editing, so important. I like both the things that I've published or with Deliverance that's going to get published. Like I engage a very thoughtful and rigorous editor who's going to give me a lot of feedback and really tear it apart.
Yeah.
And I want that because it helps me. I think everybody, if it's your friend or a professional editor, you should engage somebody to read your stuff beforehand. It is so valuable to get feedback, and it's helpful for the people who are going to purchase your thing that someone has read it through, at least proofread it, but also just so you can learn about what you're writing and hear an outside voice. And it's made me so much better. I've learned a lot from working with my editors, and I will try to get multiple people to read it. Sometimes I'll ask them for various things. I'll just want, what do you think about this as a keeper? or what do you think about this, like structurally, or do you think these mechanics are strange? I will ask specific questions so I can get specific feedback, and it's super valuable.
Yeah,
I
agreed.
always get a keeper to read it as a keeper, someone who hasn't played it, someone who wasn't in any of my playtest groups. They don't know anything beyond the basic premise. Like, okay, you bought this scenario. Can you run it as written? What are the places that you are confused about? What are the places you think there's not enough transition or enough connection to get people where they need to go? Do you think you could pick up the scenario and run it the way that I've written it? And I get someone to do that for every scenario that I write. It's extremely useful.
Yeah, it definitely sounds invaluable. So we have a couple of questions in chat that I'd like to get to. So Rick X1 asks, as a non-author or DM, what do you think is the best place to start for someone who wants to start writing their own scenario?
So speaking from my experience, something I did was the Write Your First Adventure course. There is a Call of Cthulhu track by Paul Fricker that takes you through step by step by step, creating your scenario, start to finish. There's even stuff on layout in there, which is why I did my own layout on the first scenario. But having that kind of structure where they take you through bit by bit by bit is really helpful, because then you don't feel as lost. I was completely overwhelmed when I said, okay, I'm going to write a scenario, but then I had all of these modules taking me through each piece by piece by piece. And even though I didn't write it the way they told me to, because I used my 3 bullet points method, knowing how to go about writing it and knowing what the structure of a general MR scenario would look like, having people explain to me hooks and things that you can use, and just knowing that there was that structure there for me really got me from point A to point B and all the way down to point Z. I know a lot of people who've gone through that particular course for writing their first scenario and have found it to be extremely useful. And it's available all the time, so you don't have to rush through it in a month like I did. You can take it at your own pace and figure things out as you go, and you'll have the support from the modules there as well. So that would be my recommendation, is something along those lines, to help you get that structure, and also to feel like you have support, so you're not staring into the void of writing.
Oh boy, the void of writing. Dave, what do you think about that? Where does someone start at?
I'm honestly, I echo what Rina has said. That's what I did for my first scenario. I took the storytelling collectives course, and that's what got me writing my first scenario. It gave me incentive. The other thing that I would highly recommend is read scenarios with a critical eye. Just, you don't have to run them. Just read them and pay attention to what, as we've already discussed, what you like, what engages you, the elements that are at play, and the structure, and what is involved in putting it all together, like dramatis personae and the stat blocks and all these other pieces. It's good to know how you create a scenario for Call of Cthulhu, and that gives you an idea of how you're going to lay yours out. But really, that storytelling collective course is it's pretty incredible in terms of just getting you going. And I'm very happy with what I created out of that.
Okay, great.
I skipped the layout completely. I did not watch any of those layout videos.
Oh no, it shows. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So another question, chat. Speed Racer 77 is curious as to how you approach creating pre-gen investigators for your scenarios. Is there a particular ethos you have in regards to pre-gens? Yeah. While I am a huge fan of DeHole's house, a huge fan, I would mind your attribute scores sometimes coming out of that place. Because boy, you can get quite the investigator, or the NPC with a stack of really really powerful attributes if you're not careful. So yeah, how do you approach pre-gens for those not creating their own characters for the scenario?
I love pre-gens, and it's a very time-consuming process for me. So for Swamp Song, I cheated, and I actually lifted the characters that my players in my Masks campaign created and put them in as pre-gens, and then I created an extra one. But that was intentional. I really wanted to play with those investigators again. So that was one thing, and they fit the scenario perfectly, in my opinion. Then the one that I'm working on now, I have very specific investigators in mind, and they're archetypal. And I'm riffing off of a movie, Deliverance, and so they're based on archetypes from that movie, characters from that movie. And so I really wanted to capture them, but make them a little bit unique. And then it's important for me to, one of the things that we're talking about, things that engage me with a scenario, is like interesting characters, which has already been said, but also interesting pregens, things that I sit down and I'm like, I get this person, I get who this investigator is very quickly, and I know how to play them without having to read a lot of words and backstory. Uh, I have a hard time if you give me a big sheet of paper and I've got to read all the stuff on there in order to figure out who I'm supposed to be, because I'm lost. I can't hold all that in my head. So when I make pre-generated investigators, I try to think of things that are very memorable and interesting and fun to play that investigator, that allows somebody to sort of also use those elements to make that character their own, but it's going to make them stand out and be different from all the other investigators. So a lot of interesting personalities is what I aim for. And I agree, Dole's House can spit out some pretty powerful stuff. And I have some pre-gens that I made early on from Dole's House that I still run with because I just love them. And I got made fun of at Chaosium Con because Don't Stop Me Now was playing, and they were just like, there were a lot of complaints about how overpowered her character was.
Hey, that's okay. That's okay. I do expect in your upcoming scenario for there to be banjo playing as one of the skills. I think that'll be critical for the theme. One of those investigators needs to have the ability to play a banjo.
No spoilers.
No, that's fair. Rina, how do you approach pre-gens? And I'll
Mhm.
also ask you, having played a very recent scenario
Mhm.
that you're in work of, when you look at something like Friends of Dorothy, how do you approach those pre-gens? Because that's, again, a very specific type of choice as a creator you're making.
So I tend to usually I start with occupation. So what are the kinds of occupations that would lead people to be drawn into this scenario? So sometimes I'll write extra pre-gen so people have like 6 to choose from, even if it's a 3 to 4 player scenario. And I just think about, why would someone want to be here? Well, maybe they're an investigative journalist, like in Click Clack. They're uncertain about this haunted typewriter, and they want to look into it and see, is it actually holding the spirit of this dead Penny Dreadful writer, or is the madam really a fraud and wants to write an expose? So I start with things like that. What are the occupations that will get people there? And then I go into uh, what is their outlook on life? One sentence, what is their outlook on life? It could be something like God, country, family, in that order. That tells you a whole lot about that character right up front. So I come up with this one sentence descriptor for their outlook on life, and I go from there. And then, like with Doc, I try to give them something interesting. Maybe it's a limp, and here's why they have the limp, or maybe it's, here's this particular item that you have, a treasured possession that you have, like the whiskey flask that stopped a bullet when you were in the war. Things of that nature. I try to give everyone something, at least one little interesting piece, whether it be in the possessions or the family members, whatever it is, so that someone can pick it up and go, okay, I've got something to riff off of there. So that tends to be how I do it. I tend not to give names. I might give last names, but in general, except for Friends of Dorothy, I don't really give names because I like people to pick the gender, to pick the ethnicity of the person they're playing, all of that. So I leave those blank and just create these other details so that they can step into it with whatever they want to bring to the table.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That last point where the idea that give the player immediate agency by being able to determine several factors about
Mm-hmm.
themselves, right? So they're going to sit down and play this character. They want to determine, all of those sort of descriptors, right? You'll leave the occupation, you leave sort of a framework for them, almost in a like World of Darkness sense, where you give them a a nature and a demeanor. Like, this is who they are as a person, and this is the mask that they wear in front of everybody. I like those because I think everyone wears one or a series of masks. That's a different game, but I think it's important though that you give details like that because people might be one way internally, most likely, but when they're around other people, they're very different, and they do that for a ton of different, very human reasons. So, giving someone the ability to determine that when they sit down to play the character after they review it is really empowering, I think, especially when it comes to you know, situations when it comes to physical description, when it comes to their gender choice, when it comes to their age choice or their ethnicity, because we play in a world where there are a fairly wide and diverse cultures, and you have to be aware of that your scenario might get picked up by somebody who lives in a very different society than you wrote it in, and they might need to change things. So I guess one of the wrap questions that I want to have as we get closer to wrapping this is, how do you handle feedback on the internet?
With a giant pint of ice cream and a blanket. No. I haven't had to deal with a whole lot of feedback on the internet yet. I've gotten some very good feedback, which I always appreciate. And then I have a couple people who, someone trashed a scenario I wrote with Joe Trier from How We Roll because it was woke. Because we had a non-binary character in it, and so we had this whole comment is like, I didn't go into this scenario knowing it was going to be woke and things like that. And my first reaction tends to be, well, you gave me money, so I win there. But the second one is, I am not this person. I don't know what they are bringing to the table when they are looking at the scenario, when they're looking at how I wrote things. And so I try to take a step back and almost dissociate a little bit, not in a negative way, but in a stepping outside myself and my emotions and looking at things very logically and go, do they have a valid point here? Is this something I need to fix? Like, are they pointing out a flaw in character motivation or in the story? Okay. If so, all right, I'm going to go in and fix that. I can edit. We're allowed to re-upload things to Drive Through RPG, which is one of the great things about a scenario versus a story or whatever, is you can fix problems when they come up. So first I check to see, is this a valid critique? And then the second thing I go is, does this need to affect me? Can I do anything about it? Well, no, it's going to be woke regardless in regards to that one scenario, and I'm not going to change the fact that it's woke. But also, like, I'm not going to take this personally. I'm not going to take this as someone firing a cannonball in my direction. So regardless of what the critique is, I try not to take it personally. And that's just tends to be how I go about handling feedback.
It's tough work to do. It's tough
It's
work to
so
do.
hard. Hence the ice cream.
You're right. You put a lot of energy and a lot of time and effort and sometimes creative resources to bear when it comes to these scenarios. And the internet is full of a lot of things and a lot of people. So, Dave, tell us how you deal with feedback.
I read something not too long ago. It's like, as somebody who creates something, you're either going to be ignored or judged. And it's better to be judged than ignored. I would say, for the most part, I'm probably mostly ignored by the vast majority of the world. And with respect to the people that judge my work, some may judge it as being good and some may judge it as, falling short. I think feedback is great. I think it's very important. I work in a educational environment, and I give and receive feedback all day long. Negative feedback is definitely something that's challenging. I always, as Rina alluded to, I try to look for, is there something I can learn here? Is there something I can take to improve? Or more importantly, did I hurt somebody? Did I do something that was not intentional, that was damaging to someone. So if that's the case, then absolutely we're going to back it up. We're going to revisit it. I work really hard to try to avoid doing those sorts of things, particularly in my creative work. But I want to know if that happens. Now, if our opinions are different, that's another thing, right? If you believe, you feel that I have hurt you, but by my own internal measure, like I don't feel that same way, then we can potentially dialogue about it, which the internet is a very dangerous place for that. But I've engaged with some people. The one thing that I can point to is somebody got mad because they felt like I was promoting my scenario too much at some point. I think it was like on Reddit, and I was like, I'm sorry, like that was not like, I'm not sorry for doing that, because like I'm very proud of this and I'm happy to share it. And I'm supporting other members of my community who have helped me with this, and I took my position and stood by it. But I never try to elevate the hostility whenever I'm responding to any feedback on the internet. I always try to give myself a long pause before I respond to anything on the internet.
Yeah, it's sometimes the hardest part of it, right? Because you want to jump to your own defense and say, no, that's not true. Or you want to be able to defend yourself. Because a lot of creators, when they get that type of feedback, it's not feedback directly, right? It's feedback in a public forum that someone decides to issue their opinion in. And so you have to deal with the arena of opinion. And that can be a pretty challenging effort, right? And I think this also speaks to why scenario writing, why it's important to engage people who do not fit your like socio, not economic, but they're different than you. Those are the people that should read and review your scenario, because you are looking at it with one set of eyes, with your own predetermined perspectives on all those things. And you might say, yeah, I'm no harm, no foul here. I'm not intent, and there's no malice in what I'm writing. This is just the story I've written. And someone else might say, well, hang on, like I come from a completely separate background. And when I look at this is what I see. This is what you're projecting. Like all of the NPCs are Caucasians. All right. Now I can see that in some scenarios, in some locations, that might 100% be true, but you hold the pen as the creator. You can choose to vary that up, and no one can prevent you from doing that. And that is important, because there are very few places on earth where there are only one specific type of people. And so we're a melting pot all over the place, even in places that you might not think are that way. So I think it's really important to engage other people with different backgrounds before you publish something, even if it's just a, hey, read this and tell me what you think, right? Or check out the premise and check out the NPCs, especially if one of your NPCs is part of a group that you are not a part of, right? So that way you have that frame of reference. And it doesn't mean that checks a box, right? Like, oh, this person who's part of this group said that this is okay, so I'm free and clear. That's not what it means, right? But it is opening that yourself up for constructive feedback in the process. So hopefully, when you get into the arena of published feedback, you have less potential stumbling blocks, right? I think that's the way I see it.
I would say also, a number of times that I've gotten feedback, say on Facebook, like a lot of times I'm curious as to where people are coming from, and usually I'll ask more questions to understand where they're coming from. And on more than one occasion have I invited people to collaborate with me or help me share their ideas that they have about something in particular. And this is in response to something that I've blogged about. So I try to look at it as an opportunity to build a relationship. Sometimes, if it's a person that you can do that, obviously. Again, they're denizens of the internet that we just are not suitable for interaction. But and sometimes it's just best, the right path is to just ignore and not respond. And I think those a lot of those cases, it becomes quite clear.
Yeah, Rena, what do you think? In closing, to wrap the discussion, just make sure you get any additional
Mm.
opinion you might have.
No, I think it's an undervalued part of the process is getting other people to look at your work, people who aren't you, but specifically who aren't like you, to point out things. Like I've had people point out to me that a lot of that in one of my scenarios that everyone was white coated. I had no idea because I wasn't thinking about that. And so that's one of the reasons I've gone back and tried to make sure I don't put those labels in, especially on the pre-gens, so that people can bring their own things to it. But I never would have noticed that if someone else hadn't read it and told me, hey, there's an issue here. Right. And we all have our blind spots, and
Yes.
we have a lot of them that we're completely unaware of. That's why they're called blind spots. So having other people look at things for us and helping us find those spots so we can fix them, it doesn't mean you're a bad person that you have that you have these pieces in there that you're missing or that you wrote. What the important thing is that you acknowledge them and that you work to fix them. Right? It doesn't mean you're a terrible writer. It doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. It is not an attack on you personally. Right? So being open to that kind of feedback and actively seeking out that kind of feedback is, I think, a very important part of the writing process.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'd like the both of you to get a chance to do a little promoting of yourself before we go. I know we did it at the start. I will put links to their creator pages on drive through while they do that. And so if you would, Rena, just
Mhm.
tell us where we can find you amongst the interwebs. And
So, of course, you can find me on the Old Ways podcast, where I'm currently playing in our Coriolis campaign, Children of the Periphery. I am also the head of Mythos, so I run a lot of things related to the horrors that you find in the Cthulhu mythos, including the upcoming Lights in the Trees by Matt Doc Tracy, which I ran recently. The first part of that will be coming out next week. Uh, you can also find all of my work on DriveThruRPG, all of my scenarios, some of which are collaborations that I've written. A recent one with Joe Trier called In Darkness We Wait, which is a fun, nasty little modern scenario. Also, my most recent single scenario, which is A Long Day's Night, 1950s Mobsters in San Francisco, which I think is a good bit of 3-hour fun. And my upcoming scenario that I have coming out is an LGBTQ plus scenario called Friends of Dorothy. It's set in 1981, and I'm personally very proud of this scenario, and I'm very much looking forward to everyone seeing this when it comes out. But I will notify people on Discord when it is available. You can find me on Discord as Keeper Rina. And I am around quite a bit if you want to chat about editing, about scenarios, about anything related to horror, whatever it is. I love to chat with people.
nice. Yeah, and just so everybody knows, if you want, you can go to the Twitch page that you're on. And if you're not part of the Discord, you can jump on the Discord for the old ways through that. And that is another place that you will find Rena, should you so dare. Okay, Keeper Doc, give us an idea of where we can find you and what you're doing, what you're up to now.
You can regularly find my writing or things that I have written on prosperopublishing.com, where I'm trying to put out more stuff on a regular basis. I'm currently talking about masks as well as impossible landscapes and just a variety of creative and keeper tips. I have one scenario available on DriveThruRPG that I've written, Swamp Song. It's currently on sale for $1. I have written in Hometown Horrors, Volume 2. That's also available on DriveThruRPG. And then Deliver Us from Evil will be dropping in the next month. It's currently in layout, and Alex of the Grindhouse fame, viral fame, is doing amazing work. It is going to look so good. And it's a fun scenario. I will be at Origins next week. I will be running it twice. I'll be running a bunch of other games at Origins. So if you happen to be there, please stop by. I'd love to see you. And I just want to say thanks for having me. It's great to be a part of the Old Ways podcast in any way that I can. You guys are great. You do great work. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So for my part in this, I'm just happy that the both of you were able to come on and join us. It was a blast. I have seen the cover art for what you have coming out next. That is wild. I think it's great. I hope you frame it and put it on the wall and all that. So, but for our audience who stayed with us, we greatly appreciate it. If you're watching this in video demand, let us know in the comments below if there's anything that you'd like us to check out next, as far as any Miskatonic repository creators you'd like to have us on. We're going to do these every now and again, check in with the community at large and different communities. And as was announced today, next week we'll be back a little earlier, which will help my central time zone sleep schedule. We're back a little earlier with our with Johnstown Compendium authors. We've got 3 of them there for you. We're going to have a fantastic time talking about Glorantha and all of the intricacies and craziness that exists in the lore. So thank you so much again, and we'll just say good night, and as always, good luck.